Welcome to In the Demo, a show about the stories that get told about groups, how those stories got made, what we think those stories get wrong, and why it matters. You hosts? Farah Bostic is the founder and head of research and strategy of The Difference Engine, a strategic insights consultancy focused on helping business leaders make decisions. Adam Piano, author and brand consultant and managing director of brand strategy at Arizona State University. You are now in the demo.
Hey there. This week it's just me, Farah Bostic, Generation Refusenik, with our third installment in, as Roman Mars says on one of his shows, a series of indefinite length about all those precursors to marriage, parenthood, adulting that the press and business and politicians like to fret over when millennials seem to be underperforming, and that they will, in short order, begin to panic about for Gen Z too. Those precursors are pretty obvious. Dating, sexual intimacy, romantic relationships, the ups and downs of discovering what you want in a partner and whether you want a partner and what kind of life you want to form around that relationship, and so on. Those parts, the parts where people are fully adults, engaging in the fun and tragic parts of single life, those parts are so frequently omitted from the narratives we create around young people. Frankly, it's omitted from the narratives about old people too. Instead, we get this kind of gap. Teens and college students sext, ghost, hook up, break up, and so on, and a million thought pieces about the sex lives of young people are rushed out. Young adults don't get married right after college, don't have children right away, and we freak out about that. Then we worry about the financial stability and retirement prospects for adults in their 30s and 40s, but we don't stop to think about or interrogate what is even happening in that period between leaving your parents' home and creating a home of your own, often with someone else. We take a prurient interest in the sex lives of young people, but not an open-hearted one about how they navigate our tech-enabled world of sex, intimacy, dating, and relationships. We also, as is so often the case, focus our moral hand-wringing about them on white, affluent, coastal, urban teens and young adults, and leave behind the vast majority of us who are none of those things. So as we have looked at these themes and ideas and asked these questions, I defaulted to my mother's advice to look it up. Surely there were books written about this part of people's development. So much has been written about millennials, there simply had to be a bunch of books about this part of the experience. I mean, it's millennials and sex, obvious. Let's sell those books. But just as I found only one book about the Black millennial experience, Reniqua Allen's excellent book, It Was All a Dream, A New Generation Confronts the Broken Promise to Black America, I also found only one book about millennials and intimate relationships. So I'm excited to tell you that the rest of this episode is my conversation with the author of that book, Cristen Dalessandro, PhD. The book is called Intimate Inequalities, Millennials Romantic Relationships in Contemporary Times. She looks at the intersecting identities of race, gender, class, age, and sexual orientation, and finds that for most people in the millennial generation, things really haven't changed as much as we might have hoped, especially when it comes to heterosexual relationship dynamics. She also finds that class may be the identity with the greatest weight in ordering people's preferences and behavior. And finally, she does identify in our conversation some hope coming from those who identify as queer or who want to queer the traditional dynamics of heterosexual relationships to foster more balanced, respectful, clear, and genuinely intimate relationships and partnerships. Anyway, here's my interview with Cristen Dalessandro about her research and what, if anything, makes millennials different from the rest of us when it comes to love and sex. I hope you enjoy it.
So I'm Cristen Dalessandro. I have a PhD in sociology, so I have an academic background, which is the environment that this book was born out of. Currently, I've made a little bit of a pivot, which I think is increasingly common for people in my situation. So right now, I'm actually a senior researcher at an organization called OC Tanner, and we are an employee recognition company that also we offer products and services that aim to help organizations elevate their organization's culture, because our research has just shown that leads to a slew of positive outcomes around the employee experience. So it is a little bit of a pivot from from where I was when I wrote the book, but essentially it's kind of in the same wheelhouse because, all day long I really just study. I'm still studying people in a workplace context right now.
Sure.
So yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
And so I think you said this in some of our email exchanges, but you do consider yourself to be a millennial yourself.
Yes, I am in the millennial generation, so I'll give my age away. Yeah, and as so I guess as we say sometimes in sociology, my book could be considered a little bit of me search, but the people that I interviewed, I was lucky to interview kind of a range of different people with different identities. So we did share that age identity, but they were different from me in a lot of ways, in many cases.
Yeah.
So yeah.
One of the things I'm extremely curious about is for people who do say, "Yep," and candidly, I think some of this is because there have been periods of time where in the kind of early formation of Gen Y, Millennial, whatever we were going to call them, back in like 99, 2000, when that debate was active, there
Mhm.
was a sense that if you were born after like 73, 74, you were no longer a Gen Xer, but you weren't a millennial until you were born in like 1980, 81, 82, something in that range. And so I
Mhm.
belong to the generationless generation. And so we get to be the Oregon Trail generation, or the, what is the guy's name from, I can't believe Jordan Catalano was for a while. My so-called life was the thing. And so it's been a
Mhm.
joke on the show that when we do our introductions, Adam says he's Gen X and I make something up that day about what generation I
Mhm.
am. So I will
Mhm.
confess that is probably why I find it fascinating that every time we ask one of our millennial guests what generation they are, they say that they're millennials and they're like, yep, totally millennial. So what
Mhm.
does that mean from your perspective and your experience? What is it to be a millennial?
To be a millennial,
Mm-hmm.
just in
Yeah,
general or in the context of the book?
just in
Just in
general. We'll come
general.
to the book. Yeah.
Gotcha. So, I mean, to me, I feel like the thing that differentiates millennials from other generations, maybe the most, or something that I really strongly identify with, is that that argument that we are kind of the last generation to experience the world before the internet and really before a lot of the daily technologies that we use right now. We came of age when we didn't have that technology, but sort of finished coming of age when the technology arrived, right? So I'm part of that generation that was on AOL Instant Messenger. I had the brick phone when I was in high school. And so that is something that I think is a little bit unique. We have our little I think like every generation, we have our sort of cultural symbols and markers that we sort of associate with childhood and nostalgia. Millennials are really into the 90s, I think. I mean, and the 90s are trending right now, right?
Right.
But I feel like millennials kind of feel a little especially protective over it because we were actually there and can remember it when we
Mm-hmm.
were youth, as opposed to no shade on Gen Z or Gen Alpha, but now it's sort of kind of I think of it the way that there was sort of, I remember in the 90s there being like a 70s resurgence, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's kind of how the 90s resurgence is for younger folks today. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I really feel like it's that technology changeover.
Mm-hmm.
We remember what it was like to grow up before everybody was online, before we had cell phones, but that stuff dropped before we were adults, and
Mm-hmm.
so our youth is kind of characterized by that interesting transitional period.
It's really interesting because very early on in the myth making around millennials was the idea of being digital natives, and
Hmm.
that I think the adults at the time sort of felt like you'd be too young really to remember. I mean, I keep seeing these kinds of tropes of like, the Thomas Guide and the phone book and and all of these
Hmm.
kind of ways we found information before the internet. And what's
Hmm.
been interesting, especially in the last couple of years, I feel like, is this reclamation of actually, no, we do kind of, we were children, but we were conscious
Hmm.
before certainly like what we now understand to be the smartphone, and before everybody had a cell phone or something similar. I think that's a really
Hmm.
interesting kind of taking back, I guess, of that story of digital native, which was
Yeah.
so prevalent, certainly in the world I was living in, which was just like,
Mhm.
they've only known a world with the internet. They've only known a world with, immediacy and so on.
Uh-huh.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and part of that, I mean, just to add to that too, I think part of that was growing up online. We were that generation that sort of uniquely discovered that there's a lot there's a lot of opportunity with technology, but
Mhm.
we also have to be careful, right? I
Right.
talked to my coworker. My coworker has sons who are Gen Z, and from their perspective, they're much more cognizant of sort of the perils of putting your information online and being very online, right? And they understand how to be careful. Where I feel like millennials are part of that generation that. You know, maybe we put too much of ourselves online, or
Mm.
we weren't quite sure. We were all learning this sort of brave new world, so to speak. And so we've kind of had an interesting learning experience in that
That's
way.
super interesting too. I was having a
Mm-hmm.
similar conversation the other day with a friend of mine where um she was she had been looking through my Instagram and was like, you don't do a lot of selfies. And I was like, I'm too old for selfies. Like, so that was not our jam. The selfie, like plenty of pictures of groups of us that someone else took, but
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of selfie.
Mm-hmm.
Um
Yeah.
and then one of my other a former neighbor of mine is a I don't know, I think she's 21, 22, something like that now. I've known her since she was 5, but
Mm-hmm.
she was her kind of contribution to the conversation was about how careful she's always been online.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something that I remember when she first kind of got on to Snap and Instagram and things like that. There was a lot of like this kind of posing where
Mm-hmm.
she's on it, but you don't see her face. And it's, she and her friends would have like pictures of each other where they'd all be kind of obscuring their faces from the camera because they were children technically at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and they were very conscious of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting point too, that kind of learning firsthand about the
Yeah.
perils of that.
Mm-hmm.
And being kind of thrust into it at a developmental stage where you know, things are worth trying, and then you go, oh, well, maybe they're not.
Right.
Like, so what sparked your interest in this topic of intimacy and relationships as you were pursuing this project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I've been in anticipation of this conversation. I've been reflecting upon it. So, doing the rolling back the Rolodex to the roots of when this started. So, when I was a young grad student, literally and figuratively, I at that time, which was about 10, 15 years ago, there was this really strong interest in research on what college students were doing as far as intimacy goes. So, there's a famous book from, I want to say it's 2008 or 2009, that was called Hooking Up
Mm.
by a sociologist named Kathleen Bogle. And her book wasn't specifically about millennials, but because, of the age range that was studied, the people in that age group, I think more or less did classify as millennials.
Mm.
And there's other work and other books too that were kind of on a similar topic, right? So it was looking at what are college students doing? Are they, what is hooking up? How do we make sense of this? Is this different from what previous generations have done? And so I was working with my, at the time, my academic advisor on some research that was kind of in that lane. And in the course of that project, we realized, there's a lot of interest and a lot of work being done on college students, for a variety of different reasons. Because that's just an interesting age range to study, that sort of 18 to 22 age, very interesting. But also B, because they're pretty accessible, if you're working in an academic setting,
Mm.
college students are all around. But, that being said, we sort of stopped and we're thinking, we have all of this data coming up on college students. And, besides that, we also have data on married couples and, what people do in intimacy once they get to that sort of full adult stage, once they settle down, so to speak, once they have kids. So, research like the second shift, which you may have heard of, right? So how do families kind of divide domestic labor and
Mm-hmm.
make sense of men's and women's roles and things like that. But what we noticed that was really missing was research on that sort of in between stage, right? So what happens to young adults when they're past that sort of college age range, right? When they're sort of in their mid to late 20s, but before they're necessarily settled down, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so because of the time we decided to embark upon this project, which eventually became my project and my book. And so at the time when I started interviewing people, it originally wasn't necessarily a project on millennials. It was on that age range.
Mm.
But, upon reflection, once I gathered my data or, in the thick of gathering my data, I realized that everybody I'm interviewing falls in this millennial age range
Mm-hmm.
category. So the original goal was really to kind of capture that. What are people up to in their sort of 20s and early 30s
Mm-hmm.
before they're getting married, before they're having kids, or before they're deciding they don't want to do those things, or what their adult intimate lives are going to look like. What are they doing in that age, in that in between time? And again, because it was a study happening at a particular point in time, I was doing this research in the sort of 2010s,
Mm-hmm.
started actually in the early 2010s, and then the book was published in 2021, so almost a decade. It became a book about millennials because
Mm.
that's where all of these people were falling as far as their age identities.
Right. And so there are multiple interesting things about the kind of bookends you identified of we know a fair amount about college students. Having talked to a couple of other political scientists and sociologists, one of the reasons we know so much about college students is they're in ready supply for academics. The undergrads are there
Right,
and can be incentivized.
right.
Um,
Hmm.
and then I think what's interesting, as you say, about people who are into that kind of marker of adulthood of marriage, the interesting thing there is it feels more like more economics oriented. It's very like divisions of labor, and
Hmm.
it still doesn't feel like we know that much about like the sexual lives of married people, but we or the intimate lives of them. But we know about like division of labor around parenting and housework and work and all the rest of that. So this is very interesting. How did you then go about sort of designing a method for finding people that are not just like hanging out in the halls and also are
Right.
not in these kind of econometrics focused studies? How did you go about designing your method?
Uh-huh. Well, initially my project started as sort of a side quest, if you will. So I was working on a few different things, and going back to how I mentioned before, my advisor and I were kind of interested in this age range. We were actually in that camp of doing research on college
Mm.
students, but I was like, I'm going to do this little side quest and see if I can recruit some older people. And so, because I am a millennial, I actually was able to sort of start with my social group.
Mm-hmm.
So, I did what we call in social science snowball sampling. So basically, I would kind of just put the feelers out to people I knew, right? Like, oh, here's people I know in this millennial age range. Do you all know anybody who might be interested in talking with me about this topic, right? And so then I kind of solicited or elicited interest in that way, because I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and I'm not saying this is the case for everybody, but surprisingly, I found that people were really interested in this topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I did get a fair amount of interest from just putting the feelers out. And then once I sort of I kind of call that the sort of pilot phase of the study. And then once I finished that, I was able to kind of expand that a little bit. And I actually ended up going back to kind of circling back to something we mentioned earlier. I actually ended up advertising online to see if I could gather more participants in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, so my study, it is a qualitative study. And, nowadays I think the technology is, especially post COVID, right? Technology has really impressed me. And even just us talking today, right? It's really easy to do a face to face interview without being necessarily face to
Yeah.
face. But at the time, I kind of experimented with doing that a little bit and wasn't satisfied with the result. And so I ended up I was sort of confined to a specific geographical area in the Mountain West US. And so, the views that I gathered do represent, they're not necessarily representative of like millennials on the East Coast, for example, or, millennials in the South. These were people in a very specific area. But yeah, I advertised online and I was able to get people to sort of meet me face to face at a location of their choosing, wherever they felt comfortable. And yeah, that's really mostly how I gathered my participants. I also, once in that sort of second phase, when the study got more official, I suppose, I was able to do some snowballing there as well. So if people knew people that they thought would be interested, I gave them my contact info so they could get in touch with me. And overall, it was really a fascinating experience because, again, I wasn't sure what to expect because I think it's a lot to ask people to talk about their intimate lives and, if they want to get into it, their sex lives. My interviews mostly focused on intimacy sort of more broadly. So not necessarily, I didn't really ask them invasive questions about their sex lives, but if they wanted to get into it a little bit, I allowed them to go there within reason.
Sure. Yeah.
I did sort of an open-ended strategy with my interviews, but most people were extremely open, and they, some people, it's a little bit. In some cases, it was a little bit like a therapy session, I think. People had things they wanted to talk about and they wanted to get off their chest. And, a couple people told me afterwards, like, oh, this is such a great conversation. And, I loved this interview. I got to do more interviews. And so, yeah, so it was it was really encouraging in that sense that, people were really were opening up. And I do think there's something to be said for me being, kind of an anonymous source, right? Because, everybody that I interviewed, their identities are protected, right? They all have, everybody in the book has a pseudonym. And I would change things here and there so that you can't link their story back to them, in the off chance that you would know these people anyway. Right. But so there, I think there is something to that where, if people understand that this is a confidential interview, then they're willing to open up and say things that, they might not say necessarily if their name was going to be attached to it. So,
yeah. I mean, as a qualitative researcher myself, I find that it never stops surprising me many years into this work, how candid people are willing to be about really hard topics, and really kind of personal things. It almost seems like, this is going to be an overstatement, but it has seemed over the years like the more personal, the more fraught, the more kind of potential exposure to shame a topic carries, the more candid people become. Like they need a place to get it off their chests, and someone who's like, I think it's even different than talking to a therapist, where like you're going to a therapist for help. You're not coming to me for help. You're just telling your story, and that might be beneficial, but like it's a completely like frictionless space. It's just, it's fascinating. It must've been a lot of fun doing the work. Were there any things that whether you consciously walked into it thinking you had an expectation of what people were going to tell you or not, was there anything that kind of surprised you or seemed like you just weren't expecting to hear people talk about these things in this way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some things weren't so surprising to me. I think going into it, for example, the way that I divide my book is I kind of center one identity category, and then I try to look, if applicable, I look at sort of the intersections of different identities with that category. So, for example, like one chapter centers gender, and then throughout that chapter, I also discuss whether or not there's, if, for example, like sexual identity impacts how millennials are talking about gender. But that being said, I had done some previous work on gender as a gender sociologist. And so some of the stories that I was hearing from women and men weren't so surprising. I kind of expected that, make a long story short, one of the things I find in the gender chapter is that the stories women and men are telling, especially straight or heterosexual women and men, the stories that they're telling about their experiences in relationships, they sort of, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, kind of help justify or shore up some of those gender inequalities and gender issues that we know from previous research already exist. So, there were things like that that weren't so surprising, but there were other categories that I think there's less research on that was a little more surprising to me. So, for example, one of the chapters centers social class. So basically, I'm looking at how do discussions of social class figure in these millennial stories about their relationships. And honestly, I was pretty surprised because, and I'm thinking about it too in contrast to race. When millennials were talking about race and ethnicity, especially millennials who identified as white, they were pretty careful stepping around how they talked about race. They didn't want to appear like they would say anything that could be construed as racist. They wanted to be sensitive about the topic. But when they talked about class, they were much more I guess you could say brutal in how they approached class, especially millennials who are kind of coming from more of a privileged class background, or those who maybe weren't from sort of an affluent background to begin with, but that was something that they had as a goal for themselves. Millennials, the millennials that I talk to, and again, I don't necessarily know if this is unique to them. And we can talk about this later. I don't think it is, but I was surprised with the sort of hard and fast boundaries that some of the participants set up. For example, there's one person I talked to in the book. His pseudonym is Oscar. And, he comes from a background that, he told me when he was growing up, his family really sort of oscillated between poverty and lower middle class. So they really had a hard time kind of getting a foothold into the middle class, and arguably never really did. But as a sort of coming of age adult, he was able to get a college education, move away from his hometown, sort of get a foothold in a professional middle class career path. And, when he was talking about social class and his expectations for partners, he was a little bit unforgiving in terms of his expectations, right? He and a lot of people that I talked to, this was kind of the common thing. They would use this sort of class coded language, right? So it would be they would say things like, oh, I expect a partner to value education and to get an education, right? With the sort of unstated, the sort of the part that was left unsaid was that, people who are not on this sort of class advantaged path don't value education, which, I don't think is, that's not really the whole truth, right? There's a lot of issues with resources, and it's just there's a lot I could say about that. But it was interesting to me that that some of the people I talked to, they didn't mince words as far as what their expectations for class were. I think it's just because, they're even just going back to kind of contrasting it with race, I think especially for millennials, there's been more discussion, and there's been sort of, even when you just look at sort of the media that we've consumed growing up, right? Like I remember growing up, sitcoms and things like that would occasionally deal with issues of race. And it's another whole thing we could get into, but a lot of times it was the colorblind approach that would be taken, right? Like this idea that race matters, but it shouldn't matter. And maybe if we pretend it's not there, we can all live in equality happily, right? But, I feel like the conversations around social class didn't have, and this is just, thinking about my upbringing, I didn't see those happening as much. And I'm guessing that for the people I interviewed, that also was not always the case. And so, that we didn't get those messages that, oh, this is a nuanced thing that, it's not all about your personal, will to succeed, or however you want to put it, that, determines what social class standing you're going to have. But there's all these sort of structural advantages and disadvantages that go into where people ultimately end up. And so I did think that was kind of interesting that, again, I'm not sure what I expected, but I didn't expect them to be so, open about their feelings on social class, I guess.
That is super interesting. And it is something that stands out in the book as people talk about the types of, it comes up in the chapter. I was just revisiting the chapter on age because I was looking for something specific for a totally different thing. But these kinds of, I even think about the kind of, I've come to think of it as like the Josh Hawley formulation of what manhood is supposed to be, which is this like, you get married, you have children, you buy a house, and that makes you a Republican. But like, I guess ideally that's the ladder to conservatism. And it's a very interesting order of operations. And it does not seem to be the order of operations that, in particular, the straight men in your study are talking about. They want to feel more financially sure-footed before they enter into a marriage. It's not marriage as a route to financial security. It's the other way around. Financial security as not a route to marriage, but as a precursor to marriage. And that seemed kind of true regardless of their class background, that I don't know, that like marriage is an expense, and they need to be able to afford it in some kind of meaningful way.
Right. Yeah. And I think what I saw with a lot of the men as well is it's kind of that intersecting of expectations around, what their expectations are as far as getting married, and that expectation that they are going to have those sort of exploratory, sexual relationship exploratory years, right? So yeah, that was an interesting thing as well. And I did see, going back to class, I did see that among the people, at least among the people that I interviewed, with the men, they did have that sense that, I should be financially secure before I enter into a marriage. That was a pretty strong story, like you said, among everybody. But then kind of going back to something that I just mentioned, what I really saw in their stories is the reality of their conditions really impacted what that ultimately looked like, right? So for the men who were on sort of a class advantage trajectory, or who already were coming from a class advantage background, they were sort of willing to, or they were pretty adamant that they needed to wait, right? Like, I am absolutely not getting married until I, build up my savings, or, I'm absolutely not doing this until I can get a footing in this career that I want to get a footing in. But for the men who are on what I call in the book a sort of class disadvantage trajectory, or, in my case, I didn't actually interview anybody who was downwardly mobile. So everybody I interviewed who was on that path was already coming from a sort of poor or working class background already. For those men, it was kind of heartbreaking in a way, because a lot of them told stories of kind of trying to get a foothold in, saving, or in a career path, or in education. But just because of the challenges that come with coming from a poor or lower middle class or working class background, they ran up into roadblocks, right? I'm thinking of one of the participants who, he entered college at one point, and then he had to drop out for financial reasons. Kind of tried to do a few different things, and then he ended up, his girlfriend ended up pregnant, and he kind of came to this realization of, I'm blanking on the pseudonym I used for him right now, but I think and I forget what chapter it's in, but I think it's in the marriage chapter, where he's talking about how, I used to have this idea that I had to wait for marriage and I had to do these things, but, ultimately where I'm at right now is I just have to live my life, right? He was like, I have a daughter, I have a fiance, and I've kind of put that behind me, that as far as that, like, I have to accomplish all of these things before I entered into this agreement. So, what I saw was that it was really, people do what they can with the resources that are available to them, right? And so for men who didn't have those resources, they kind of had to rethink a little bit what that trajectory looked like for them.
It's and I think this is one of the things that has been particularly of interest to us as we look at far lazier characterizations of millennials, is that lurking underneath those characterizations is typically an assumption about, frankly, American or Anglo-speaking countryness, whiteness, an upward trajectory from a class perspective, or of starting from class advantaged, and then not really thinking about anybody who is not college bound or college educated. And so it's interesting in thinking about what you were just talking about against some of the I know that Anne Case and Angus, I'm going to forget his last name, but they wrote the book about deaths of despair.
Mhm.
They are really emphasizing right now in their work this line of distinction between people who have a bachelor's degree and people who don't, and that
Mhm.
bachelor's degree seems to be correlated with, among other things, higher total life expectancies, marriage rates, all of these, and just kind of lower rates of addiction, general overall health. Obviously, that's reflected in the mortality rates, but it's very, it's like in a way, like that's a really compelling line of demarcation. It cannot be like the thing where like, and so the answer is everyone should get a college degree,
Right, right.
because the fact of not having the college degree is inflected by all of these other largely class defined
Mhm.
obstacles or incentives, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, given how worried certain public figures are at the moment about the state of young men in particular, but kind of the state of men
Mhm.
in America in general.
Right. And I think, I think the bigger thing is that in the United States, we really don't have the safety net that they have in other
Hmm.
industrialized Western nations, right? When you look at, and I mean, I'm just thinking too of extrapolating this to something like childcare,
Hmm.
if you have, in other countries, they subsidize childcare, right?
Right.
But in the United States, we have women most of the time, or a caregiver, or
Hmm.
it's an individual solution. If you have a child and you want to work, then you either have to have family or someone else who's willing to care for them for free, or you have to, put them in daycare, which is costly and cost prohibitive
Hmm.
for many, many families, right?
Right.
And I think, it's the same thing, or kind of linking back to what you were saying, it's just that in the U.S. we do, culturally we are that sort of a nation that values individualism, right? And
Hmm.
increasingly, neoliberalism is working its way through,
Yes.
through all facets of our society. And, we don't have that safety net. And for millennials and, for everyone else as well, we individuals kind of have to take care of themselves,
Hmm.
right? And that's where class becomes really important because, if you are from an advantaged background, or you do have those connections that can help you out if something happens, if
Hmm.
you get sick or lose a job or something like that, you can get back on your feet. But if you don't have those connections and resources, then something very small can turn catastrophic very quickly,
Right.
right? If you lose a job and you don't have savings, that can snowball into losing your housing, losing a lot of different things. And so I think, yeah, it goes back to that issue of we don't really have the safety net,
Hmm.
right? And so that influences how people kind of think about their lives. And I also, even just going back to something like, the stories of the men who were so sort of anxious really about achieving that economic stability. Part of that is gendered.
Hmm.
It is that there are these sort of staid expectations that men are going to be the breadwinners, even if women are working. Interestingly, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because if we don't have that safety net in place, men are going to be anxious about that. And again, if you want to have and this is assuming sort of a sort of stereotypical heterosexual two-parent family.
Hmm.
If you want to have that setup, which is what a lot of the heterosexual men I interviewed, that was the goal of most, if not all of them. The expectation or the sort of fear was that if they did have kids, well then someone's going to have to take care of those kids, or we're going to have to figure something out, and then I'm going to have to be the one who's sort of the main breadwinner, and in a way, the sort of lack of safety net and this sort of fear around the uncertainty, I think, is what is helping sort of perpetuate some of these old ideas and stereotypes around things like gender and gender roles
Hmm.
that a lot of us would like to see challenged more, but that it seems like once we do one step forward, we do two steps back, right?
Yeah, that was something else that was fascinating in reading the book, is because I do think we have, because we have these things that, Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks or whatever, it's kind of actuarial data about marriage, birth rates, when people start having
Mhm.
children, those kinds of things, income. I think there is a way to explain delayed marriage, delayed parenthood as being, there's certainly pockets who want to explain that as being a product of feminism, for example.
Mhm.
And so what struck me reading the book was um, how incremental any gains attached to feminism might be, and how really entrenched these kind of traditional gender role ideas are. And that,
Mhm.
again, I think one of the things that is so great about the book is its attention to these intersections, because it can't all just be chopped up and said like, okay, here's the gender thing, all right, set aside the gender thing, now here's the class thing, because
Right.
gender and class and race, all of these things wind up playing off of each other and creating the conditions for the outcomes that we're seeing. But it did, I
Mhm.
have to say, even though I don't really, I'm very much an ever was kind of thinker, like things don't change that quickly is my experience. It was
Mhm.
still surprising to me how entrenched some things that we would say in the pages of the Atlantic or the New Yorker or whatever are outdated gender ideas
Mhm.
being reified, and even if not like, I don't know, espoused, certainly accepted.
Right.
And I'm curious about whether that surprised you, or whether, I mean, it sounds like you have some previous work in gender, so maybe it didn't.
Right. Yeah. I mean, thinking about gender, it didn't really surprise me. And I guess going back to what you mentioned before, one sort of glimmer of hope that
Mm.
I found in talking about gender is the queer participants in particular.
Hmm.
So the LGBT, and I had a fair number who did self-identify their sexual identity as
Hmm.
queer. Um, and so, and I'm using the word queer, thinking about like queer critiques of gender and
Hmm.
marriage and things like that. And so, the participants who were self-identifying that way, they really did, it wasn't about sexuality. It was also about queering gender in
Hmm.
their relationships, right? And so there was kind of a glimmer of hope there in that, I really found that queer folks were doing this sort of, in their relationships, they were kind of putting in the effort to
Hmm.
explicitly challenge gender expectations and try to fight against them. The sort of downside, or not the downside, but the sort of unfortunate to that is that, even though they were challenging gender, there were some power dynamics that came up in different ways,
Hmm.
right? So, things like age,
Yeah.
there were, even if gender was being challenged in some of their relationship stories, there were clear sort of power dynamics and awkwardness around age that came up.
Hmm.
So it is, I do, and I mean, thank you for saying nice things about the book. But well, I also think that one of the things that is beneficial to taking this sort of intersectional approach is that even though it was a little a little, it's much easier to kind of compartmentalize. So, it's a little more challenging to try to look at the intersections sometimes. But, one of the benefits to taking that approach is that you can see that, oh, things might be going well in this area, but here's this other area where maybe things can be, you know,
Hmm.
improved a little bit. So yeah, I do think that that taking kind of a queer approach to gender is a hope. The sad thing about that though is that I do think there's a lot of folks who are especially if you take like a gender class in college, right?
Hmm.
Or if you explicitly go out of your way to read and research these topics, there's this information is out there and available for people. But the downside is that I don't think the average person seeks that information
Mm.
out, right?
Hmm.
And, I kind of had to do a little self reflection too, because as a sociologist and a gender sociologist, at the time I was doing these interviews, was really embedded in this literature and sort of surrounded by, other people in my cohort who were embedded in this
Hmm.
literature and, explicitly trying to take queer approaches to gender in their lives, whether or not they identified as queer. But doing these interviews was really a reminder that, oh, the average person isn't exposed to this information. And, and where I did my interviews, I think we can categorize it as an area of the country that is pretty progressive on things like gender. And so, if folks that I interviewed were not,
Yeah.
did not know this information, then I think that it's pretty safe to say that it's probably the case in most of the country as well, that, this isn't something that's kind of common parlance, or,
Right.
it's not like everybody is familiar with queer approaches to gender.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's like, it gives me hope, but at the same time, I do think, unfortunately, the broader pattern is trending more towards, despite all the progress that we have made, and there has been progress,
Sure.
we still have a ways to go as far as, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the average person and how they approach gender in their lives.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm skipping ahead or
No.
soapboxing a little too much, but this is the reason why I think, and this is in the conclusion as well. This is the reason why I think policy is really important, because I think policy sets the precedent, right? So, and I give this example, and I know I've mentioned this earlier in our discussion, but I keep turning to it because I feel like it's such an obvious example of what we can do now to make things better. So something like parental leave, right? So, there's been a lot of discussions. I feel like it's something that kind of comes up on and off in the news every once in a while. We come back to it, and then, it goes away, and then it comes back, sort of cyclical. But, these discussions around maternity leave and, federally supported leave, it's it's good, on the one hand. It's like, okay, I think it's good that, we want to mandate maternity leave, but if we don't set that up as parental leave,
Mm.
then that excludes a whole group of people who, are contributing to the birth or adoption of a new child, but who, aren't having the time to, aren't getting time off of work to bond with that child and to help with the parenting. And if we're just focusing on maternity leave, in a sense, that kind of re-entrenches the inequalities that we're trying to challenge,
Right.
right? Because that sort of sends the message that, oh, this is a woman's thing, and not just a women's thing, but a cisgender women's thing,
Yes.
right? It's the cisgender women who are giving birth. They can have maternity leave, but everyone else kind of has to, scrap together their vacation or whatever else they might have available if they want to take time off. And so, that's just something that, changing that conversation from, well, number one, supporting leave,
Right.
but number two, changing that conversation from maternity leave to parental leave can, that can influence how people think about how they're going to structure their intimate lives when a child
Mm-hmm.
arrives, right? And that's something that, to me, it's something that, it's a pretty simple thing that we can do, but, not going about it the right way, or, just kind of staying in the situation we're currently in, which is not
Yeah.
good, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That's just going to re-entrench the issues that that we're trying to address, right?
Right. I mean, I think it's such an interesting, two things came into my head as you were talking about that. One is the reaction to Pete Buttigieg taking parental leave. And,
Mm-hmm.
from the right in particular, this kind of like, what does he need parental leave for? He's like, and it was
Mm-hmm.
like, to your point, it is a cisgendered feminine responsibility, and so
Right.
therefore in a gay couple, what, neither of them should take parental, who's staying home with this
Right.
baby?
Yeah.
Like, what are we talking about here? But it is
Mm-hmm.
so gendered and so heteronormative that
Mm-hmm.
that is a really interesting observation. But the other part of it is, you do see there's a paper out in a law journal that I have not read yet, and I can't remember the title of it, but it is basically making the argument that when we change the legal regimes around things, then acceptance of those things changes. So,
Mm-hmm.
Obergefell yields the result of people being more accepting of gay marriage, and
Right.
Lawrence yields the acceptance of gay relationships, and certainly
Mm-hmm.
the rejection of the idea that the cops should be able to bust down your door because somebody called the cops on you for having sex with someone of the same gender.
Mm-hmm.
And um and so those policy decisions, those rulings have real impact on kind of creating socially accepted permission structures for people to do different things. Um,
Right.
and I think it's also really interesting what you were saying before about the kind of phenomenon of queering gender, because I think that there's a lot there that's just about like a deliberate decision to try to go against all the grains that are just rubbing up against us all the time. And it's
Right.
hard work.
Uh-huh.
And I think can even have the result of people who do not who might not have previously identified as queer, who are like, but I have committed to this approach to thinking about gender and gender dynamics, and so I will go ahead and identify this way now because I'm all in on this approach. It is still a very small group of people. It would be nice if it were something we could have broader conversations about. I think the policy piece of this is interesting as well, because as you were talking, one of the things especially on the class subject, that I think is always missing from the millennial narrative, because like I said, we always kind of default to thinking about college educated, urban, upwardly mobile millennials, typically white. And that is that, like, I think there have been periods in this country where we're more class conscious and less. And I think there was a period there where, you had both kind of affordable prices on things. Interestingly, you had like affordable prices on things, relative job security, and employer-backed pension systems as a social safety net, plus a growing social safety net. And high tax rates, guys, high tax rates. And yet people were really upwardly mobile. It was a big economic boom. Out of the baby boom, out of that period is the baby boom generation born. So maybe it's really good for birth rates too, if you're anxious about those things. And then we kind of slide into like, okay, pensions basically go away, but prices remain okay. And so you can still have a nice enough middle class life for you and your children without a college education, or without a job that's going to lead to a pension, because housing is still affordable and commodities prices are still affordable. And I think the thing that has changed for millennials, and changed around that 2008 period, but before that, really around 2000, is that ended, right? There's the social safety net gets squeezed. Pensions are long gone. Job security, no, we have a gig economy now. And so all of these, there are policy choices. I mean, one of the other things that kind of blew my mind was the expansion of child welfare in 1984. They consciously made a choice in Congress to only start those benefits for kids who were born on or after 1982. And so they basically said to all of those kids that were still children in 1984, oh, I'm sorry, you were born in 1978. And so we don't care about you. We're writing you off. And all of these things have policy implications. These policy implications have real world impacts for the people who are living with it. And I do wonder if that's part of the overall story, is you can't kind of ignore the class dynamics anymore. There have been periods where we could and periods where we couldn't, and we're right now in a period where you can't. And so maybe that's also why people are so willing to speak candidly on the high end and the low end of the income ladders about how class affects their lives. It's just in your face all the time.
Yeah. And I think it's to your point, I think it probably has to do with anxiety as well, right? That just sort of, and I'm just thinking about, since we're talking about the class part of the research, and I'm just thinking back to the interviews now, and there was palpable anxiety in those interviews.
Yes.
And especially in the men's interviews.
Yes.
I think it was in everybody's interviews, but especially the the cisgender men. I mean, they had an extreme amount of class anxiety, and they really did feel like, oh, this is going to be on me. That not only am I, again, intersecting with gender, not only am I going to be supporting myself, but if I have a partner and kids and any other dependents, that I have to make sure that I'm kind of in a position where we have enough to get by, right? And I do think that that's something that I kind of wonder what the future will look like. And now I'm thinking it would be interesting to kind of replicate this study with Gen Z and see how they talk about it, right? Because, for millennials, I don't know if I see that changing. I think if I were to replicate, if I were to talk to these same millennials or other millennials today, I suspect that the narrative, even though, we've got all this, the world has changed in even the last 5 years. I suspect that their stories around social class in particular would be similar to what they were a handful of years ago when I talked to them. And I think if anything, it's probably actually just gotten worse, right? Like the
Yeah,
anxieties.
it feels that way.
We might even spend more time talking about class just because I think it has been in the news more and has been sort of on people's minds more, especially in the last few years. I think, I don't know, maybe it was the pandemic effect that, just the impact that had on jobs and on people's lives. And, the sort of emergency safety net measures that were put in place because of the pandemic and that are now going away. It's something that, again, I think it's something that's not really going away. And I think it would be interesting because I do think there's more discussion now around class than even a few years ago. And especially compared to, when millennials were sort of coming of age and in their sort of early 20s and going in there. But yeah, I mean, that being said, there's more discussion, but I don't think things have improved, right?
No. No, I think anxiety is here to stay, is what it feels like.
So yeah.
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 I did want to ask you about
sorry.
one thing. And it is a thing that I felt was there and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I see it in some of the work I do as well. And so I just wanted to see if you had any insight into this. And that was that there also seemed to be something different happening amongst women of color in their approach to intimate relationships as opposed to white women. And that there's, I don't know, there are threads of being a bit more skeptical, a bit more conscious of power dynamics and control, of being more protective of themselves in a really kind of consciously defined way. We've seen this we did some work recently with expectant mothers, pregnant people, and there was a lot more of that conversation. We did a little vox pop exercise around this question of intimacy and relationships, and the people most likely to say, I want to make sure that, in the kind of cliche parlance, like I have my mask firmly attached to my face before I start dealing with anybody else's stuff. Like I want to make sure I'm in a good place before I bring someone else into this. That was way more pronounced coming from women of color. And again, tiny, these are qualitative studies always, but I'm just curious if you observed that, if you saw anything else interesting happening amongst particularly women of color in terms of their approach to intimate relationships.
Yeah, I think they were definitely the ones that I interviewed. I think definitely had a different approach and they definitely had different experiences than the white women. I think the difference is just that well, I think there's a gender dynamic too, right? Because the stories that men of color and women of color told me were a little bit different, and I think it has to do with gender. But ultimately, women of color were really on the receiving end of not to mince words, racist actions on behalf of the people that they dated, right? And it was just, it was pretty disheartening because it was just, story after story of these sort of these experiences that they had that were hurtful. And it's hard to parse out. You can't really parse out whether their partners are being intentional or unintentional, right? And even if they say they're being unintentional, it could actually be intentional until they get caught and then they claim it's unintentional, right? And so I think that it's just having experiences like that over and over again. I think that just impacts how you approach relationships and how you think of them, right? So just one example, multiple women talked to me about being worried about being like a dating experiment for partners, right? So, are they dating me because they're interested in me? Or are they dating me because they've always wanted to date somebody who is, Hispanic or who is Black or, whatever. And a lot of time, I think mostly they were talking about white partners in these contexts, but it can happen in other cases as well, right? I did have, like one Hispanic man who I interviewed who, was talking about dating Black women and how, the other people he knows think about Black women and how they kind of characterize them as sort of different sorts of people based on race, right? So white women have the benefit, even though they have issues too, they do have the benefit of not having to deal with the feeling that people want to date them because of their race or their ethnicity, right? At least in the people I interviewed, that didn't really cross their minds. It was all about how they were approaching men who might not be white or who might be of some race or ethnicity that they thought was different or exotic, right? But when we're looking at the women, or talking to the women, they're on the receiving end of that.
Right.
And I think the men had more to say, but I think that, or I suspect that they did, but again, the data that I have is just what they tell me. And so, a lot of the men in the interviews, they talked about the men of color. They talked about race being important or significant, but at the end of the day, they kind of portrayed themselves as, yeah, but I can handle it. It's
Right.
fine. Whereas the women, I think, were much more forthcoming about, no, this was actually a hurtful experience that I had. And, unfortunately, I, at the end of the day, instead of, I guess it's not their place to necessarily educate those partners. And also, even if they tried to, I suspect that the partners probably wouldn't respond well, right? Or and you can see it from some of the other stories that are in the chapter, right? Like people will kind of get defensive and be like, oh, it wasn't really, you're making it about race, but it wasn't actually about race. Like it's not like
Right.
that. And so women of color are really in this hard position where they're on the receiving end of this hurtful treatment, but they also, and I don't blame them. There's not really an easy recourse to sort of addressing the situation, either because they've tried to and partners have been defensive, or they suspect based on their past experiences that people are not going to take it well if they do bring something up. And yeah, so they're kind of, so, that's what they're dealing with. And so I think that just dealing with those experiences, just that impacts how you approach relationships going forward. And, I kind of saw that, it was some of the women who were talking to me about sort of their future plans, right? Like it clearly impacted their past experiences, clearly impacted how they saw themselves moving forward. And I do think, as you mentioned, that it does kind of create sort of sort of an awareness, right? Of, I have to be sort of a little more on guard to protect myself from being hurt, essentially.
Right.
And that's something that, the white women I interviewed, again, it wasn't even something that they had to think about at all. And so yeah, I think, race matters,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because, with the topic of race and ethnicity and these sort of interracial relationships, it's something that we want to think, especially in intimacy, we want to believe and we want to think that, love can conquer all and that race doesn't matter and that we can be colorblind. But, at the end of the day, that colorblind argument, instead of helping, actually hurts, right? I think what it does, especially for white folks in particular, is that it just, it sends the message that race shouldn't matter. Therefore, if we bring up race, then we're, making it matter. And that's where we don't want to go. But actually, being silent about it is the thing that perpetuates some of the issues that we
Yeah.
see.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting to think about that too from a couple of perspectives. And one is I don't know if we've talked about this on the show or not, but I had recently asked Midjourney to generate images of a millennial couple sitting together listening to a podcast. It was just sort of a joke. And but
Hmm.
like 2 or 3 out of the 4 images that Midjourney created had mixed race couples. And it's
Hmm.
becoming incredibly common now in marketing to portray mixed race couples and mixed race families, even though it's still, relatively rare to have, mixed race families. This is, of course,
Hmm.
the degree to which we have a lot of mixed race children who are millennials has a lot to do with Loving versus Virginia legalizing it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but we don't, you never see behind the behind the scenes, right, of these portrayals. Um, occasionally you do in television or movies or that sort of thing, but like in the commercial for the Cheerios family, like you don't know what it took to get here and
Hmm.
and how hard that was to accomplish. It's just sort of taken as this fait accompli, and it's part of what I think was important about taking a look at the work that you've done is digging underneath all of these different elements, as opposed to just sort of saying age group and like all the people born between this year and this year, and they have these tendencies or they over index on these qualities, and so therefore
Hmm.
everything's different. And I think there were kind of 2
Right.
things for me with the book, and one was the importance of how all of these different factors intersect with one another and how people negotiate those intersections to figure out what they want in a relationship, what they want in a partner, how they want to engage in intimate relationships, and yes, absolutely the importance of policy choices.
Right.
If there was like a takeaway that you want people who come across your book to have, is I mean, there are probably many, but is there like a main thing that you hope people walk away from the book experiencing?
Yeah, well, if I can cheat, I actually think there's two
Sure. Yeah.
things that I would say. So the first thing that I think, kind of situating it within this discussion of generations, I think an important takeaway is the fact. Well, I'm going to say the fact that I know it's a strong word, but I feel like other research backs me up on this. So the fact that millennials maybe aren't so different from other generations as we like to think that they are, right? So, a lot of the things that I saw millennials discussing, a lot of the goals that they had for their lives were similar to what we see on research on Gen Xers or on baby boomers, right? That being said, I think there's also sort of a knee-jerk reaction to, and I think this happens with every generation that comes up, right? We kind of put all of our hopes and dreams on the young people,
Yeah.
like, oh, they're going to save us, they're going to make everything right,
Yes.
they're going to get us out of the depths of despair that we're in right now. And so the other thing, I would say too, on that point, that you know we shouldn't put all of our hopes and dreams on Gen Alpha or other groups, because there's a good chance that because of what we see millennials dealing with, they're also going to be dealing with similar things in their own ways, right? Like, even if it shifts a little bit. So for example, maybe if we talk to Gen Z or Gen Alpha, maybe they would have different things to say about race, or maybe they would have different things to say about class, or they would approach gender maybe a little more queerly than millennials do. That doesn't mean that they are going to quote unquote solve our problems, right? This is ongoing work that they're going to have to do as well. And also, to something we talked about as well, what's going on just in society and on a policy level is also going to impact what they do. And so depending on what, that looks like, that's going to influence how people do their intimacy lives. Which, so that's kind of my first point. But the second thing I would bring up, which kind of relates to that, is that, I think there's kind of, I guess, in sociology, there's kind of this interesting tug of war between, sociologists describing our world and then giving the recommendations for, okay, what do we do now? There's a lot of folks who will say like, oh, it's just our role to describe and not necessarily, advise. And then there's other folks who say, no, like the advising part is like the goal of why we even do what we do. But that being said, I do think there's kind of an interest, the sort of best solution to some of the issues that I've identified, I think it's both structural and individual, and which I think, actually our discussion kind of plays nicely into this, which is that, what people do at the individual level really matters. If you are somebody who does care about, just for example, making a more egalitarian gendered relationship, then, you do need to put in the work to, be educated on what that looks like, and, check out research that people have done, and, ask your partner what they think, right? That's something simple that people never do, that, that could probably solve a lot of problems. It's just, asking your partner what they think about something, and then not being offended if they're critical of something that you're doing. But at the same time, again, those sort of broader structural patterns, what's happening at the policy level, that's important as well. And so, if we care about something in particular, or, we want to see positive change, or a change in a certain direction, I think it's helpful to get involved and to get informed with what's going on, and to be part of that conversation and not just sit back and let things happen, right? So it's kind of, the solution is sort of two-part. It's individual, but it's also, structural. And those things, there's overlap between those two things as well, right? Because usually, I think, hopefully, as my goal with the book was to try to show this, which is that, what's happening on sort of a broader social level matters for what we do in our individual lives, right? And so, yeah, we don't have, it might feel overwhelming, like, okay, well, I can't go to Washington and like make them change laws by myself,
Mhm.
right? But, what can I do today? Today, I can do something at the individual level. I can check in with my partner. I can see how they're feeling. I can, assess how I act and how I think and
Mhm.
why a shift might be helpful.
Right. It's an interesting and important thing to do to connect the dots between the individual potentials and the collective action problem.
Mhm.
And you kind of have to have both. Like you as an individual
Right.
have to participate in the collective action. And I think what often happens with stories around it seems really pronounced with millennials, and we'll see if it continues with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, is this very individualistic approach of like, no, you specifically on your own, and don't bother the rest of us with it, should work on this
Mhm.
thing. and
Right.
and like just work on you, and collective action is pointless. And I think drawing
Mhm.
those connections, and bringing that home is really important. I'm
Right.
aware of the time, and I just want to tell the audience that the name of the book is Intimate Inequalities, Millennials Romantic Relationships in Contemporary Times by Cristen Dalessandro. You can get it on where many books are sold. Certainly I got it on Amazon. It's from Rutgers
Yeah.
University Press. It's really an interesting look at these different elements of people's identities and how they intersect around intimate relationships, and is really the only book I found on the subject that was specific to millennials. So I want to thank you for that, because I was like,
Yes. Cornered the
yes,
market. All right.
cornered the market for sure. And I really want to thank you for your flexibility with scheduling and taking the time to chat with me today. This is a great conversation. In the Demo is produced by Farah Bostic and Adam Pierno with support from The Difference Engine, and edited by Allison Preisinger and AMP Studio. Music by Omega Man under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research and supporting information. Please rate and review the show. Someone told us that helps.